Hello, welcome to Gardener's World. Now we're in June, I think we can safely say there'll be no more frost, which means that we can plant out and put out those tender plants that really won't take any frost at all. And dahlias are certainly one of them. I've got a new variety that I'm trying this year. This is called Verone's Obsidian. It's a simple flower with wonderful burgundy petals with a bright yellow centre. And I'm going to grow them in pots. And if you're going to grow a dahlia in a pot, it wants to be as big as you possibly can, because if you have them too small, they run out of space and nutrition by about mid-August. Or if you've got a bigger pot, they can continue to grow and you get nice big tubers. So I've taken these out of store in March, potted them up in old potting compost just to grow them on, and kept them in the cold frame to keep them frost-free. They've been hardened off for the last week or two, waiting for this moment, and we should have a decent root system. So those are the roots, and inside there are the tubers. And of course it's the tubers that hold the goodness that will create the flowers. So I'm going to pop that in the pot. Yep, actually I've got it just about dead right like that. Now this is a fairly rich compost. Dahlias need good drainage, but they also are quite greedy. So if you can, enrich a peat-free compost with your own garden compost, ideally, but maybe a bit of soil improver, and add a little bit of grit or perlite just to make sure that the drainage is still there. Leaving a little bit of space at the top of the pot so we can water it, because these will need watering at least once a week, and when we water, we feed a liquid seaweed feed to all our pots. And with any luck, that will flower and shine right through summer. Now, coming up on today's programme, Francis meets a couple who've created a garden inspired by their travels around the world.
We have quite a lot of things like the restios, the crocosmia, that will be happy with cold.
Restios, we've travelled in South Africa, up in the Cederbergs, I think it was, and we saw restios covered in frost, so clearly they can take very cold temperatures.
We make a return visit to Adam as he continues work on his new garden.
When you sort of move into a garden, you want to make it your own. Well, I'm lucky. I've got these wonderful Taxus domes here. What I want to do first is add to that structural planting and then bring in some wonderful colour.
We meet a window cleaner in Truro who has a passion for planting trees.
Just one urban tree can bring the whole place alive. In come the birds, in come the pollinators, in come the flowers and the colour, in comes the seasonality.
And I will be adding tomatoes to my container veg garden. I've got a few plants to add to the dry garden. This is Santolina, cotton lavender. It's small, it makes a mound ideally with these beautiful little yellow button flowers. And it loves full sun, poor soil, and hopefully in the revamped dry garden, it should find a good home. I've got a grass here. This is Festuca glauca. We'll add this in the back. It doesn't grow very big, but it will add this spray of really lovely grey-blue colour. I love glaucous plants. Whilst the dry garden is slowly emerging, the irises that I planted about 4 years ago are stunning. Now, the third plant I've got is a familiar one to many gardeners, and this is Stachys, or lamb's ears, and of course called that because it has these very soft, felted leaves. And then it has pink flowers, again adapted well to drought. When you're placing plants, obviously you put them out in the pots before you start planting and just make sure that you've got the spacing right and the relationship with other plants. But also think about the bigger picture. It's really important to always keep reminding yourself, what am I trying to achieve? And what I want from the dry garden is to get this feeling of abandonment, that there used to be a building of some kind here, and the planting should look as though it's a combination of some plants obviously put in by man, some which have grown naturally. Now, pop that in, the same height as it was in its container. And just remember, for Santolina, don't let other plants around it crowd it, because that will be enough to shade it out, and then it will get straggly. Now I'm putting the stachys right on the edge so it can spill onto the path if need be. Now I've travelled a great deal in the Mediterranean, so that's informed and inspired my choices here in the dry garden. But Francis went to Worcestershire to meet a couple who've made their entire garden as a kind of homage to a lifetime of travel.
One of the joys of gardening is discovering and then growing new plants. And no matter how long you've been gardening, there's always something new to catch your eye. And for the couple who owns this garden, their eye wanders far and wide. Adrian and Sheila James like to travel, and they use their garden and the plants they grow to evoke fond memories of their many trips around the world. So Adrian and Sheila, this is obviously a quite elaborate garden, but where do you get the inspiration for it?
Morocco, part of Spain, Iran,
Amazing.
which was an experience, but a lovely experience. And if we're in this country, nurseries then come into it as well.
Of course. And what's this particular space inspired by?
I'm fascinated by formal courtyard gardens, often people call them Islamic gardens maybe. And the idea when we laid out the garden here was we wanted to put something at the heart of it which really reminded us of that style of garden. And so we have all the elements that you'd find in a Persian-style garden. We have the water, we have the use of the colour green, we have shade. If you sit here, it's quiet, it's peaceful, it's contemplative. It sort of does all the things that a Persian-style garden should do. The terracotta pots that you see lining the side of the rail, they're actually a permanent feature here. We then drop into those terracotta pots, plastic pots of plants in season. So, for example, earlier in the year, these would contain daffodils. Then we have tulips after that. Sometimes at this time of year, we might have agapanthus in them, but this year we've gone for the spider plant.
And I love your cyperus because it really echoes that water, being a water-loving
Yes.
plant too.
Yeah, we keep it in a saucer of water all the time while it's out, and it's very easy to propagate.
It's one of those very odd plants, isn't it? Because we propagate it by taking a stem off, leave 4 or 6 inches of stem on it, and we literally turn it upside down in a bowl of water. And the roots come from the centre of the plant, from the centre of the flower as is now. So each generation is a sort of upside-down plant, really. So, Francis, this is the salvage garden. When we laid out the garden originally, we laid it out in a series of compartments or rooms with different things in each area.
They all link though, don't they? It doesn't feel separate.
We wanted them to flow from one to another.
Yeah.
So separate areas, but with flow through them.
You do have a bit of everything, don't you?
Yes,
do.
lots of nice bulbs in the spring in there.
So you must have quite a microclimate here. You have quite a lot of things like the restios,
Yes,
the crocosmia, that will be happy with cold, but they really won't cope with being very
for
wet.
example, restios, we've travelled in South Africa, up in the Cedarburgs, I think it was, and we saw restios covered in frost, so clearly they can take very cold temperatures. But they were growing in very, very free-draining conditions. And so we have a restio over in the duck patch, for example, that stays permanently in the garden on very, very free-draining soil, of course, never sitting around with its feet in the wet. It survives quite nicely.
But there's also a real mix of other things, aren't there? So you have the Indian bean tree and the tetrapanax, and then this huge eucalyptus, which is obviously Australian, and you don't notice it particularly when you come in, do you? But it just gives that feel that you're in a hot country.
And then we can liven it up by adding dahlias that brings in the colour into the garden.
And I love the architectural plants that you have in here as well, like this phormium with its amazing flower spikes. And even things like your cannas, and it just gives that really lush, unusual feel.
It gives you a feeling of opulence almost.
Definitely. As well as creating a wonderful garden, Sheila uses the plants from around the space for her other hobby, which is flower arranging. So we're doing agapanthus?
Yes, agapanthus.
Do you take them when they're about to come into flower, or do you take them when they are fully in flower?
A bit half and half.
Half and half, okay.
Yes.
And we're strictly within a theme of South African, so I can't go off piste and start adding.
Well, this is a bit off piece, but there's a lot of grasses in South
So maybe
Africa, so maybe that's okay.
If you say it's okay, I'm sure it's okay. How many grass stems are you using, Sheila?
Just a couple, just to give it a bit of lightness and airy-fairy.
I might stop there then. Cocosmia keep well.
Oh yes, and they add a different shape altogether, and the seed heads of them they look just as good as when they're in flower.
Oh, well, that's
and they'll
good.
keep for ages. Gardening's my passion, flower arranging's my hobby.
It's funny how they're always connected. So Sheila, with the Nephophia, am I taking blooms that are blooming but not yet gone over at all?
Yes,
Or ones that are just about to bloom?
either of those, but not the ones that are starting to go.
Okay.
Now, I've one big exuberant one.
One big exuberant one, okay. You're the boss, Sheila. Well, there we go. What do you think, Adrian?
I think they're absolutely amazing. They're really nice bunches of flowers, aren't they?
Well, I think with this much to choose from, you couldn't really go wrong, could you? It's such a beautiful garden. And I know that no one can pick their favourite plant, none of us can, but if you had to pick one that had a particularly significant or special memory for you, what would it be?
Well, I think we'd find it very difficult to choose one in all of these flowers, but I think both of us would probably go for the very plant that you've been cutting some foliage from, which is the Acacia Baeliana purpureum. It's a South African tree, it's associated with our travels, and it has two really good seasons. In the winter, sort of February time, January, February time, lovely bright yellow flowers which are slightly scented, and it's a real beacon in the garden when, you know, much else in the garden is fairly quiet, to be honest with you.
Even now, though, it's beautiful.
And you get it against a sky that it just sets it off. Really stands out.
Yeah. In that case, I'm very sorry that I cut some foliage off your favourite plant. But thank you so much for having me today. It's been so lovely.
Oh, you're very
You're welcome.
It's been lovely to have you here.
I do think that all of us are bound to be influenced by gardens that we've seen anywhere. And I've always said that the best education you can have for any gardener is to visit gardens. Now, I brought out these agapanthus from the greenhouse. Three types of agapanthus I've got. I've got evergreen ones, which are not hardy and obviously keep their foliage, and they must be kept frost-free over winter. There are the head-borne hybrids, which are evergreen but hardier. And finally, you've got herbaceous ones, which this is a good example of this little one here, which die back completely and therefore are much hardier. And if you've got free draining soil, these can stay outside in a border all winter. Now, what I want to do is repot and divide a couple, because once you start seeing new growth from the herbaceous types, it's the best time to repot them or even plant them out. This one, you can see, has completely filled the pot. And I should have potted this on a few years ago. In fact, the counsel of perfection is to divide them and or repot them every 2 or 3 years. Now, what I do have is this wonderful tool, because what you do is you slide it in around the pot and just work round, and it's quite hard work because the roots sort of attach themselves to the terracotta, which is slightly porous. Okay, let's give it a go. Yeah, it's coming. There we go. There you are. That is all root. Just a mass of root and no compost at all. And one of the extraordinary things about agapanthus is they flower best when they're constrained. So when you repot them, if I put that into a big pot with lots of potting compost, all I get are lots of leaves and no flowers. So what I want to do is put it into a new pot that is not too big. Yes, that's perfect. Ideally, you want no more than about an inch, 2, maybe 3 centimetres of fresh potting compost around the roots. So we'll put a crock in the bottom. Let's sit this in. Oh, that's okay, right. This mix is a bit of leaf mould, a little bit of garden compost, a little bit of peat-free compost and a lot of grit, and that will be perfect. That's fine. It's also happy and repotted. Now, when you have a larger one like this, it makes sense to divide it. This is an evergreen one. This is a little bit eager, actually. Right, let's see if it's done its job. Not too bad at all. There we go. Now, you can see, very root bound. Now, there are a number of ways you can do this, but probably the best thing is if you've got an old saw, not much good for cutting wood anymore, but ideal for cutting through woody roots like agapanthus. There we are. So there we have a lot of root, pretty solid. That will make a perfectly healthy, fresh plant. I've got 2 plants for the price of 1. The only trouble is it's a curious shape, leaving big space on 2 sides of the pot, no space at all in the other. So what I'm going to do is divide it again and then turn the sides in on themselves so I have a more compact plant, although the same mass of agapanthus. There we go. That will be okay. Now is the time, if necessary, to trim the roots, and that will stimulate regrowth. Okay. Now, we should get flowers this year because this year's flowers are formed in agapanthus in the previous year's growth. Next year, as long as the pot isn't too big, we should also have decent flowering, and the one thing we can be certain is we will have a healthier plant as a result. Right, I'll do the others, and in fact, I plan to do the whole lot over the course of the coming week. But it's time to visit the first of your gardens this week. Well, I say your gardens because although it's definitely a beautiful garden, it doesn't seem to belong to anybody.
Hi Gardeners World, my name's Beth and I live in Deal on the East Kent coast, and today I wanted to show you a little bit of garden that my neighbour Tasha and I did together last year back in lockdown. So this patch of ground didn't really belong to anyone, but it was really sort of scrubby and brambly, and together we created this space which I think is amazing and everyone can enjoy. We've planted loads of bulbs and spring flowering blossom trees, summer flowering verbenas and daisies, and it's just completely gone crazy this year. What we found really nice was that when we were working on the garden together, various neighbours came out and offered us seedlings and plants from their gardens, so that all made a big difference. It's been really nice to watch people's reactions. We get a lot of dog walkers down here, so everybody that walks past comments on how different it looks. Hopefully this video has helped inspire you to do something similar with your neighbours. Thanks for watching.
I'm sure there are thousands of places like that, what we used to call lost spaces, not really belonging to anybody, or at least no one knowing who should be looking after them. If communally they could be created into borders and gardens, just think of the pleasure it would give to people. Now this here is the tree I planted in March as part of the Queen's Green Canopy. This idea that we'd celebrate the Jubilee by planting thousands of trees in gardens and parks and spaces right across the land. Now, this is a fastigiate silver birch. Fastigiate just simply means it grows upright, which will work here in the grass borders. And you can see that it's not doing much, which is absolutely fine. Because if you've planted a tree as part of the Jubilee celebrations, don't expect it to do anything at all in the first year other than be healthy and just have healthy leaves. Because all the activity will be going on underground, developing roots. And once they've started to grow and get established, they can then support new growth in years 2 and particularly 3. After year 3, you'll really start to see it grow away strongly. So to help that underground root growth, make sure that it's watered. If it doesn't rain for a week, give it a good soak. Keep it as weed-free as you possibly can. A metre wide is not too much, because weeds take a lot of the moisture and the goodness, and then mulch thickly to suppress further weeds and to keep that moisture in. And if you do that, the tree will be completely happy. Now, talking of the Jubilee, we're in the middle of a long bank holiday weekend. I hope you're enjoying it and spending as much time as you possibly can in the garden. And we on Gardeners World are having our special celebration of the Jubilee and trees by visiting 7 tree champions over the coming weeks, 1 for each decade of the Queen's reign. And our first visit takes us to a window cleaner in his hometown of Truro in Cornwall.
I think it's safe to say that I have an addiction to tree planting. Well, and trees generally. Just one urban tree, one tree in a prominent place can bring the whole place alive. In come the birds, in come the pollinators, in come the flowers and the colour, in comes the seasonality. I'm Richard Argall. I'm a window cleaner and I've been cleaning windows in Truro since 1983. I kind of just started looking around town and thinking there's not really many street trees, not many trees generally in parks and gardens in the places that I was working. So I then contacted the Parks Department and asked if we could plant some trees in some of the public grounds around Truro. I actually started planting virtually anywhere and everywhere we could get a tree in. I imagine we're up to about somewhere in the region of 1,000 trees. It did become an ambition to plant a tree in every street that I clean windows in. So there's very few places where, whilst I'm working, I can actually enjoy and care for and look at a lot of the trees we've put in. I like the idea that I'm a tree curator for all those trees within the city. Not necessarily just trees that I've planted, because any tree can bring you pleasure. Sometimes it's not very easy to find time to visit the woodlands outside of your immediate locale, but most of us experience some greenery within our lives. Maybe you open your curtains to it, or maybe you go shopping and have to walk past it. Maybe you're in your car in a traffic jam sitting next to it. And I think that's the importance of urban tree planting. I particularly like it when I can place a tree within a very stark urban environment. If you get it right and you can get that tree that you want in, it can completely change the way that that square, street, garden feels. It completely can wake it up. You do have to be very careful when you choose your tree. The main thing that you have to consider is size of tree and how it will fit into the space that is available. If you've only got a small garden to play with, and I must admit a lot of my customers might only have small gardens, then my favourite tree for putting into that space would be an Amelanchier. There's quite a lot of different cultivars, there's quite a lot of different species. They sing and dance. They're beautiful creamy white flowers. A lot of them are followed by fruits which are really tasty if you can get to them before the birds. I really like this idea of getting edibles into the public realm so that you can start foraging for grub when you're out and about. And typically when I'm window cleaning and feeling a bit peckish, I'll help myself to a berry that might be ripe or some unusual fruit. Crabapple jelly, I'm very happy with. Although I once made a mistake and tried to make crabapple gin, but it was more like paint stripper, I'm afraid. Really good if you had a sore throat, but not much good for anything else, really. Some of those trees now are substantial trees, 30 years old, some of them, and most of them are very happy, healthy trees. And to think that they will continue, hopefully, for many, many years to come and to lots of different people, that's the satisfaction. It brings me a great deal of happiness. I'm 62. I could retire in 3 years' time, and I'd like to think that my retirement plan involves me being able to walk around the town as an old geezer and actually taking a tremendous pleasure in all the benefits that those trees are going to bring.
It's a wonderful legacy to think of all those trees living on for generations to come and enjoyed by everybody and doing good. It's very beautiful. I put my citrus fruits, oranges and lemons, out here into the Paradise Garden from their winter protective quarters a few weeks ago. And they've settled in, and you can see they've got nice, vigorous new growth on them. And once you see that new growth, it's time to prune. And when you're pruning any kind of citrus for maximum fruit, you do need to let light and air into the plant. You want it to be nice and open. A pom-pom, a ball on a trunk, is a really bad idea for citrus if it's fruit that you want. Now, the first thing to do is to open up the centre. A crowded centre like that is going to have bad airflow. You're not going to get enough light in. So I'm going to get my secateurs and go in there and cut low down like that. So that comes out. Now, I've had this orange since 1994, and I've learned that it's tough. They're very forgiving plants. You can cut hard into old wood and it will grow back strongly. So if you make a mistake, it's not the end of the world. Now, essentially, I don't want this to get any bigger, but as a rule of thumb, it's a good idea not to take off more than a third of any tree of any kind in any 1 year. Remember, this will need a weekly feed with a high potash feed. We use liquid seaweed. And if you haven't done so already, mulch it with fresh garden compost, or if you haven't got your own, a good soil improver, and that will certainly make a difference. And give it a good drench once a week with water, and then let it dry out completely in between watering. Final point is, if you've bought a small citrus plant and you're expecting it to produce fruit, you might have to be patient, because sometimes they can take up to 5 years before they start fruiting. Now, still to come on today's programme. Adam plants a shady north-facing border.
That is my first real border planted in this garden. And it feels good, but also it shows you, doesn't it, if you stop, give a little bit of thought, you can start to create something that is really quite special and puts a smile on your face.
I'm adding some tomatoes to my container vegetable plot. And this is a variety called Gardener's Delight, which grows very well outside, as well as in a greenhouse too. And I've decided to do a bit of an experiment, because I have used grow bags in the past, but not for quite a long time. And I thought I'd give them another go. And I've chosen 3 different ones for 3 different techniques. And at the end of it, see if there's a difference. And we'll put Gardener's Delight into all of them. Now, the first thing they all say is give them a good shake. So let's follow the instructions. Shake it well. Get rid of the compaction. There's that one. Okay, that's puffed up quite well. Finally, this one. On this one, which is bigger and in fact is the same size as a normal bag of compost, I shall simply follow the directions, cut 3 holes and plant 3 plants directly into it. Now this one does say make drainage holes around about ground level. So I'll just make little knife slits like that, and then again at this end I'll just put a few drainage holes in there. Now let's cut out the squares where they say. Now we just go like that. Now, as a rule of thumb, you shouldn't plant tomatoes until the first flowers open. And when you're planting any tomato, it doesn't matter whether it's in a grow bag, the soil, outside, in a greenhouse, in a pot, try and bury it as deep as the first pair of leaves, because that will anchor better and also grow roots that will improve feeding. Now, all cordon tomatoes need support. So how do you provide that for a grow bag? Because you can't stick a cane in. So that's something I'm going to have to bear in mind. But let's see how that does. I'm going to move this back out the way for the moment to give us some room. Now, this one, I will cut holes where they say. The instructions on this specifically say, do not pierce the bottom. But it does have very small perforations, which means that you're not to make any extra drainage holes. Now this one, I'm going to use these pots. And what I'm going to do is take out the bottom. Now I've prepared a couple already. You can see that the bottoms have been cut out, and it's very easy to do. Just using a pair of secateurs, hook into the drainage holes and cut. And that will go into here. And put it in like that. And then this. And then we'll sink that in. Okay, I need a little bit more compost. Now this is actually compost from a spare grow bag, so I'm not cheating by using extra special long meadow mix. Right, now we're ready to plant into that. Of course, the whole point of doing this is to give a better root run. And the more roots we have, the better the tomato plant in theory should be. Let's move on to the third way of using a grow bag. The idea is to cut the grow bag in half, turn it on its side so we have 2 polythene bags, if you like, filled with compost, and plant directly into that. So we cut like that. What I am going to do here is just make some drainage holes. Okay. So we turn it on its side, and we've got a container filled with compost of a nice size. So I'm going to move these before I plant them. And we'll plant this nice and deep. In you go. Now obviously, you could use this technique, not just with a grow bag, but any bag of peat-free compost. Now I will water them, and as I say, I'm going to have to turn my mind on how best to support them, because all of these will want support. With tomatoes, it is important to keep a regular water supply. And I would stress that this is not a scientific experiment. This is just me trying out different ways of maximising the potential of a grow bag. And I'll also be growing tomatoes in terracotta pots, in raised beds, maybe even plastic pots as well. And towards the end of the summer, we'll see how they get on. Grow bags are ideal for a small plot, or even if you don't have a garden at all, and you can produce a relatively large harvest from very few plants. Talking about produce from a small space, this is a bed of parsley. We love parsley and use a lot of it. And I planted this out last August, and we've been harvesting it from September right through till a few weeks ago. It's now going to seed, and I'm going to clear the bed. But before I do that, I just want to show you, if I pull one up here, look, that is an individual parsley plant. That is one little seedling of parsley. So when you buy it maybe from a supermarket in a pot, which is full of maybe 20, 30 little seedlings, it looks great. But when you're growing them at home, raise each individual plant so it has the space to grow and can be this big. Then you can cut it 4, 5, 6, 7 times and get masses of leaves. We collect great bunches of it because we treat them as large plants. This is a tray of climbing beans. It's a variety called Blue Lake. And I like it for a couple of reasons. One, because it's very tasty. And two, because it has rather narrow string beans, very like some French beans. Now, whatever type of climbing bean you're growing, you do need a strong support system. And you need to put that up before you plant. And then the second thing is to plant inside the supports. Because you're walking up and down and picking the beans and watering on the outside, that will get compacted and that would damage the roots. And I'm going to plant one bean to each of these uprights and just pop that in like that. You will need to tie them in until they get established. After a few weeks, they will develop tendrils that will cling naturally, but just give them a hand to start with. I've added lots of compost to a trench in between these bean sticks because these are plants that really respond well to moisture. They don't like drying out. So the compost is as much to act as a sponge rather than directly as a feed. These should flower in about 4 or 5 weeks' time, be ready to harvest a couple of weeks after that. So we're looking at the middle to the end of July. And the important thing in this growing period is to keep them well watered. So if we do have a very hot, dry spell, these will be high on the list for a good weekly soak. Now it's time to visit the second of your gardens this week, and it takes us to Bermondsey in South London.
Hi, my name's Alice Thomas, and welcome to my garden. As you can see, it's not very big. It's only 8 by 9 metres, but we pack a lot into the space. This has all been grown in the last year because we moved back in after some building works. I'm very pleased with how it's coming along. One great thing about the garden has been how all the bits tended to fit together. I'd originally planned it as quite separate zones, so we had wildlife in the front and then raised beds for fruit and vegetables and flowers in the back. But actually, when it came to it, we've managed to get cut flowers out of this lawn, and then we've been able to feed the bees and the birds with the flowers and vegetables as well. I grew all of our wedding flowers here this year, and that included this wild rocket, which has beautiful little yellow flowers that the bees absolutely adore. We also have white campion and red clover growing by the side of the wildlife pond. And those are perfect for the bees, but they also look great in my bouquet. Slightly more classic flowering plants include this pink rose, but as you can see, the leaf cutter bees have had an absolute field day. We also get loads of flies eating the nectar off these Chinese asters just before they flower.
It's been a really interesting first year to be gardening, and particularly trying to grow flowers with the weather that we've had. But I've learnt that with the salvias, sweet peas, snapdragons, cosmos, all kinds of beautiful things are really good for the birds and the bees as well. And I've just cut a vase full of them. So on that note, I'm going to go and put these on the kitchen table.
Thanks, Alice. Your wedding bouquet sounds lovely. And if you've got a garden, any size, anywhere that you would like to share with us, then please do. We'd love to see it. Go to our website and you can get all the details. Particularly, actually, if you are celebrating the Jubilee in your garden. We'd love to see that. The damp garden has changed quite a lot this year, and to my mind, in an entirely good way. The problem was that although the pond was fine, the back area, which is surprisingly large, was pretty dead. We weren't using it for anything really. It was dominated by a couple of quince trees, which in themselves were nice. But I cut them down and dug out a big crescent-shaped bed to make a bog garden. And what we've got here are plants that are adapted to growing in very wet conditions. So you've got ferns like the regal fern, you've got the shuttlecock fern, persicaria, big Rheum palmatum, which already is doing very nicely. And you can see the dots of yellow from the candelabra primula, which is picking up the colour of the irises and is working very well. And as well as making the boggy area at the back, we lifted up paving here, which was getting flooded all the time and getting very slippery, made a soft path that curves round, and a new border here in the corner. Now this is almost in total shade. It never gets direct sunlight. Perfect for hostas and a few ferns. And a little strip here, which looks a little bit bare at the moment, but is specifically for candelabra primulas. So I'm excited about that. However, not everything is perfect, because the Camasias are proving to be a problem. Camasias are absolutely lovely, and I wouldn't be without them, but I have learnt over the years growing them that if you grow them in a border, they can become quite invasive, and their foliage in particular gets bigger and bigger as the plant grows and takes a long time to die back and suppresses everything around them. If you want decent flowers, you mustn't cut the foliage back. You've got to let it die back naturally. So what I'm going to do is take out some of them. And if you are growing Camasias in a border, I would recommend that you regularly thin them. So I'm just going to dig out the bulb if I can. It's probably quite deep in there. Out you come. Now, do you see? These are the bulbs, and it's a great cluster of bulbs. We only planted one. Now, what I'll do is pot these up, let them die back naturally, and then in the autumn I will plant them into the orchard individually. Problems like this, if you think of them as a problem, and I don't, I think of it as a process, are a result of time in a garden. You do some new planting, inevitably it takes a year or two to get established, then it looks great for a year or two, and then either it becomes too much, too congested, just like these Camasias, or maybe dies back and needs regenerating. But Adam has recently moved to a new garden, and we rejoin him as he continues to develop it.
I just love June. The sun is shining. I've got a few days off to celebrate the Queen's Platinum Jubilee. There's excitement in the air. And all over the garden, there's this sense of anticipation. Summer is within reach. And although it's still early days in the garden, it really is starting to come alive. I've been a busy boy since you were last here. I've been concentrating my energies on the front garden here and just to get the veg beds built so I don't miss too much of the season. So I've got one large bed that later on in the year here we'll have two paths put through the middle and timber all the way around. Behind me I've got another bed that'll be mixed herbs, planting, edible, flowers, and then I've got 6 still beds and 9 still beds over there. I've also been trying to get the structural planting right and to do my bit to support the Queen's Green Canopy in a Jubilee year. I've also planted 4 step-over apples. Now, these are a great way of adding fruit to a small space. So these are actually step-over apples. There's 2 cookers up there and 2 edibles here. And when I say step-overs, they're exactly that. You imagine you'd be able to step over them, but they're grafted onto a dwarfing rootstock, and that's how you buy them, and then they've been basically trained across. So at the moment I've put them in, I've tied them in nicely, give them a little bit of a tidy up. I'm not worried about fruit this year. In fact, actually, in reality, I'll probably tease off anything that really appears, let them get their roots in this year, and next year they'll really start to perform. But that's the front garden. Today there is something that I really want to get on with in the back garden. As you can imagine, I haven't been sat around, I've been a busy boy. And you know when you move in somewhere and there's these little things that bug you? This was one of them. As you walked through this gate, you came pathway along here, straight into that paved area in front of you, and that all felt exposed and there was no real wow. Whereas now, I've dug it out, boom, it's going to be in your face. And then you change direction and move yourself round. And today, what I want to do is get this planted up. But it's interesting, when you sort of move into I suppose let's call it old garden, new garden, you know, you want to make it your own and you're inheriting structural planting. Well, I'm lucky, I've got these wonderful Taxus domes here. What I want to do first is add to that structural planting and then bring in some wonderful colour. So, before we put these plants in, it's a little bit about the border. It's north-facing. I think straight away we think north-facing, not a lot of light. But then also what we worry about is things like rain shadows, so this patch here getting too dry. Interestingly here, because the garden comes down on layers, this doesn't dry out that much. And I've been keeping an eye on the sun over the last 4 weeks, and the higher it's got in the sky, the more light this gets. So for the summer months, it gets a lot more light than you'd think it would. Planting we already had, as I said, we had the Taxus that they worked through and then the Amelanchier, but I had these sort of red-veined sorrels that have seeded from somewhere else in the garden. And that's another prime example. You pick a book up, that would tell you that that wanted sunnier position than what it gets. It's happy, so I'm going to leave it. Then what I've done planting-wise, the rose has gone in here, and this is Shropshire Last. Again, we look at north-facing walls and think, oh, you haven't got that many plants. There is. There's a lot of roses, there's honeysuckles, there's hydrangea that will go up there. This, what I want to do is grow it partly as a column, and then I'm going to actually shape it from there. I think a really simple point is how we approach growing climbers up walls. For me, I just use these really simple horizontal wires. So what I've done is started at the bottom, probably about 30 centimetres just over from the ground. I've put a screw eye just about every metre. And then we put the wire. The wire's galvanised. It's about 1.5, 2 millimetres thick. Don't go too thick because it becomes very hard to twist round. This is not that difficult. It's about just putting a nice vertical line up, marking it, getting your distances right between your lines, and using the pliers, I'm just going to pull that as tight as, and I'm not over pulling, and then just tying that off. And not only, you know, is it good for maintenance, but it's just really easy. Once that's in, we can now get this rose in. You hear a lot of conversation about how deep you should plant your rose. The rootstock is just below the ground. So actually, I'm just going to go with what the grower said. So this is containerised rows, which means you can plant it any time of the year. The further you get into summer, obviously the more TLC, watering, looking after this plant's going to need. I think growing anything against the wall, it's that early year forming that is really important. And what I mean by that is don't let it just go up and then try and train it. You know, pick some shoots, tie in the horizontals, make sure it's tied in nicely going up there. And actually, if we have a few windy days as the season goes on, don't let the plant wave about, because then you'll end up with wind rock, which will start to loosen those roots at the bottom. So there we go.
One thing that really caught my eye at the Malvern Flower Show was Geranium Phaeum Springtime. A lot of geraniums are great for dry shade. And here's a tip for you.
When you buy a plant like this and you get it home and the flowers look beautiful, the best thing to do is cut them off. All right? I know, you can always put them in a vase inside. But what that will do is that will make that plant now really put the work into getting its feet in, getting its roots into the ground, and that's what you want. So next year, when it comes out, that foliage is fresh and beautiful. But straight away, my eyes getting moved over to the spotty dotty. We're nearly there. Peony, Molly the Witch. It is slow growing. The flower is fleeting, but for some unknown reason, I've always wanted to grow it. Though I want them to be part of the scheme this year, I think if I go and disturb the roots in this pot, I will set them back. So what I do now is, because I want to enjoy them in their final home, just dig a little hole, enough to sink them into the ground, which means they'll pick up moisture well, they'll get used to their final position, and then all I'm going to do is just sort of plunge it in. And then in the autumn, when I've still got warmth in the soil, and hopefully the root systems have really kicked on in those containers, I will just transfer it into the ground. So that is my first real border planted in this garden. And it feels good. I think it looks all right as well. But also it shows you, doesn't it, if you stop, give a little bit of thought, understand the soil, the way the light moves, the backdrop. And then looking in the layers, the trees, the shrubs, you can start to create something that is really quite special and puts a smile on your face. And I think that's exactly what that will do.
It's good to see Adam enjoying making his garden, and of course we will be paying repeated visits to see how he gets on. Now, it's time to sow sweet corn. Sweet corn is one of those vegetables that is best left to mid and late summer. If you try and sow it too early, it just won't grow. It needs heat. So if we sow them now, they should be ready to plant out in about 5 or 6 weeks' time and start to harvest in August and September. So let's fill that up with seed compost. So that will do. Give it a little shake. And I've got a variety called Lark. This is an F1 hybrid, so that you can't keep the seed, but it does grow very fast. It has good cobs that are exceptionally sweet, and it's the sweetness that you want from sweet corn. Now, in pots this size, I sowed 2 seeds, and I intend to weed out one but also it will act as a spare if any one pot has no germination at all. And to ensure germination, the key is warmth. So don't let them cool down. Put them in a warm place to germinate and keep them warm as they grow. I'll just cover those up a little bit. Now, I will put this in the greenhouse to germinate. If you don't have a greenhouse, do try and find a warm spot that is also sunny. Right, here are some other jobs you can do this weekend. Most tulips will have finished flowering by now. And in order to ensure a display next year, snap off the seed heads, which you'll find will happen very easily. And this will mean that all the energy from the stem and the leaves will be put into making new bulbs for next year. Homemade comfrey tea is a really effective high potash feed and of course free. Cut the plants down to the ground. Using the stems and leaves and flowers, chop them up and pack them into a container. And then top this up with water until it's full. Set it to one side for at least 3 weeks, and it will smell bad, I warn you. And then you can strain it off so that you have a comfrey tea concentrate to use as a feed. Early sown broad beans will now need supporting. Using canes and string, create a few tiers of support just so they don't topple over under their own weight. And then when the beans are finished in a month or so's time, the whole thing can easily be dismantled. Although, of course, the dual garden is completely dominated by this extraordinary bobbly wave of purple from the allium purple sensation, it actually looks its best now because there's enough else going on to set it into context. Whether it be the lovely silvery glaucous leaves of the cardoon or the bright spots of vermilion from the geum, the touches of mauve blue from the Iris sibirica, the golden of the hop, all these things are acting as a foil for the alliums. And it only lasts for a day or two, this combination, but every year I love it more and more. It's just one of those highlights of the year, and it's very, very temporary too. In a week or so, the alliums will just be seed heads, and we will have moved on to another season. That's the end of today's programme. But I'll see you back here at Longmeadow at the same time next week. So until then, bye-bye.